Hi everyone, it's Carissa. Today I wanted to show you how to do a crochet cast on. This is a technique used in knitting to create live stitches at the beginning of your work so that you can go back later on in your project and use those stitches for a variety of reasons. For example, I'm designing a cowl right now that is knit as a long strip, and then the beginning and end are joined together to create a loop. And I'm using this crochet cast on in that design, so I wanted to show you how to do it. So for this project, you're going to need your knitting needles and your yarn that you will use for whatever project you're working on. You'll also need a scrap of yarn that it should be a nice smooth yarn, not anything fuzzy, not a single ply or anything like that that's going to sort of stick to itself. You want it to be a fairly smooth yarn, about the same weight as the yarn you're going to be working with for your entire project, and roughly at least three times the width of your knitting project. We'll also need a crochet hook. The size is not super crucial, but it should be roughly the same size as the knitting needles that you plan to use for the project. So our first step is to take our waste yarn, and near one end we're going to make a slip knot, and we'll put that slip knot onto our crochet hook, not the knitting needle but the crochet hook. Tighten that up just a little bit. Now we'll take one of our knitting needles here, and what I'm going to do is hold the knitting needle in my left hand, crochet hook in my right hand. The yarn should come underneath the knitting needle, and the crochet hook should be on top of the knitting needle. I'm going to use that crochet hook to reach over and grab the yarn, and then I'll pull it through the slip knot that's on the crochet hook. And then the yarn needs to go around underneath the knitting needle again. So the yarn is under the knitting needle, the crochet hook is on top of the knitting needle. The loop that's on the crochet hook does not count, but you can see I have one stitch cast on my knitting needle here. So again, I'm just going to repeat that process. I'm going to reach over with my crochet hook and grab the yarn, pull it through the loop on the crochet hook, and return the yarn to underneath the knitting needle. So now I have two stitches cast on my knitting needle, and the loop on the crochet hook does not count. So I'll just repeat that. Reach over and grab the yarn, pull it through, and then put the yarn under the knitting needle again. Reach over, grab the yarn, pull it through, the yarn under the knitting needle. And you'll just repeat that process until you have the correct number of stitches cast on your knitting needle. Now, if you are an English knitter and you typically hold the yarn in your right hand instead, this process is totally doable as in that way as well. So, again, the crochet hook is on top of my knitting needle, and the yarn will be underneath it. So as I go to throw the yarn around the crochet hook, just pretend like this is a knitting needle. It's just got a hook on it to help you pull it through that loop. So I'm going to take my yarn, I'm going to go under the knitting needle, wrap around the crochet hook, and then pull that through the loop on the crochet hook. And then the yarn has to come back to the right hand side. So I've cast on one stitch, and I have that loop on my crochet hook that does not count. So again, I'm going to throw the yarn under the knitting needle, around the crochet hook, then I'm going to pull it through that loop on the crochet hook and bring the yarn back to the right hand side. So under, around the hook, pull it through, and bring the yarn back to the right. Under and around the crochet hook, around the crochet hook, pull it through, and bring the yarn back to the right. So I have cast on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stitches. I'm going to do a couple more. wrap around the crochet hook, pull it through, back to the right, round the hook, pull it through, back to the right. Now when you have, say we needed to cast on 10 stitches, so I've got my 10 stitches on my needle now. When you're done casting on the stitches, we're just gonna do a couple more chains on our crochet hook just to give it a little bit of a tail. So ignore the knitting needle right now. You're just going to wrap the yarn around the hook by itself and pull that through. Just around the hook and pull that through. Or if you hold the yarn in your left hand, same thing. We just ignore, a little awkward, just ignore the knitting needle, wrap the yarn around the hook and pull it through, around the hook and pull it through, around the hook, pull it through. And once you've chained, half a dozen, doesn't really matter, we're going to pull that tail all the way through the last loop. And you can trim your yarn at this point, give yourself a few inches so that it doesn't come unraveled. But by pulling that last loop all the way through, it's not going to just disintegrate on you. And when we come back at the later on in our project, when we want to retrieve those live stitches from the provisional cast on, we'll know that this tail that has the extra chains is where we want to start unraveling. That'll make sense later on. We'll show you how. So now that I have my stitches cast on, I can set aside my crochet hook, pick up my other knitting needle and my working yarn, and I'm actually going to start my project now. So I can just start knitting. Just pretend those stitches are just normal stitches. There's nothing unusual about them at this point. Just gonna knit. Turn it around. And if you are an English knitter, you want to hold the yarn in your right hand, also fine. And just knitting your way across the row, or whatever your pattern tells you to do. I'm just making a little garter stitch swatch here to show you the basics. You've already done the crochet cast on. That part is done. So that's all it is. And you'll see, your stitches, your fabric, start to form, and your crochet cast on will be down here at the bottom of your work. Now I'm going to pull out a piece that I did a couple inches on. There we go. So again, I just made a garter stitch swatch just to show you the basics, but this would apply to whatever your pattern wants you to do here. So when you want to go back and pick up these live stitches from the cast on, we're going to flip it around to the backhand side where you can see those purl bumps in your working yarn color. And I'm going to take my other knitting needle here, and I'm going to go downward through each of those purl bumps. So this is the tail of the working yarn where I started. We can just ignore that, and we'll pick up that first bump, and then there's the second bump, and go down through the third bump, and the fourth, and 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and you're going to have one fewer bump to pick up than the number of stitches you cast on. So I cast on 10 stitches, but I only had 9 bumps to pick up. So here, let me pull that out and I will show you again. Try you a little closer up here. So this is the tail. We're going to ignore that. So there's that first bump. I'm going to go down through that first bump to pick it up. and then sort of twist my needle around to go down through that second bump, down through the third, down through the fourth, etc., all the way across. Pick up each of those bumps. There we go. So I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. All right, 9 bumps picked up for 10 stitches cast on in the beginning. Now that I have my live stitches picked up, I can remove the crochet cast on, this orange strand. Now, like I said before, once we are ready to remove this, we know that the tail that has the extra chains is where we want to start. So we're going to start unraveling at this end. Now we pulled that last loop all the way through. So what we want to do is sort of pick out that last stitch. And let me show you closer up. So there's that loop. I'm just going to sort of tug at it until it loosens and pull that tail back through. There we go. Now once that tail is pulled out, I can just gently pull on it and my crochet cast on unravels like magic. There we go, and pull it out of that fabric on that last stitch. There we go. So we have our stitches, our live stitches from our crochet cast on, and then these down here are the stitches that we just finished knitting. So for the cowl that I was talking about before, this would be when I wrap it around and graft the beginning stitches to the end. Or maybe your pattern says to use those live stitches from the cast on to work a fancy border or an edging or something like that, whatever your pattern tells you to do. So there we go. We have the crochet cast on to end up with live stitches at the beginning of our work in addition to at the end. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks. Bye.